On the morning of August 31, 1985, Richard Ramirez picked up a Spanish-language newspaper inside an East Los Angeles liquor store and found his own booking photograph across the front page. The clerk saw him freeze. Ramirez looked at the face, dropped the paper, and ran. The picture had been public for less than a day. Until that second, he could still disappear into the city as an unknown man. For months, Californians had gone to bed without knowing which home he would choose next. Now his face was on every newsstand. How had police moved from scattered night attacks to this single photograph? And why would ordinary residents become the final link in the hunt? The answer was not one perfect clue. It was a chain of small failures he had left behind. A rare, obvious shoe sole had pressed into flower beds, sinks, carpets, and bedroom floors. Bullets from the same guns had crossed city lines. Stolen jewelry and electronics kept passing through the same buyers. Survivors remembered a thin man with long dark hair, prominent eyes, and badly decayed teeth. A 13-year-old boy noticed part of a license plate. Then a technician found one partial fingerprint inside an abandoned car. That fingerprint produced a name, but a name was not an arrest, and police still did not know where Ramirez was. To find him, they made a decision that could either end the hunt or warn him in time to disappear. They released his face to the public. Before the newspaper, the fingerprint, and the chase, there was a missing window screen, a son arriving to visit his mother, and evidence that would sit without an answer for nearly a year. On June 28, 1984, Jack Vincow went to the ground-floor Los Angeles apartment of his mother, Jennie Vincow. The screen was missing from an open living room window. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the rooms had been disturbed, and the removed screen was lying on the floor. In a matter of moments, an ordinary visit had become a crime scene. Jack found his mother in the bedroom. Jennie Vincow was 79 years old. She had been stabbed repeatedly, and her throat had been cut. Her clothing and the position in which she was found indicated a possible sexual assault. Jack had come to visit his mother. Instead, he became the person who opened the door on a crime that would not be understood for months. Investigators had an apartment full of violence and very little that could point to a stranger. One quiet object offered more than the rest: the window screen the intruder had taken out and left behind. Technicians processed the screen and recovered fingerprints. In 1984, those prints did not produce a name. They were preserved, filed, and left waiting for a future comparison. Nothing at the time told detectives that Jennie's murder belonged to a series. Los Angeles County was vast. Its police agencies were divided among many jurisdictions, and one unsolved apartment killing could disappear into the volume of daily cases. For 9 months, the prints remained silent. Late on March 17, 1985, Maria Hernandez drove into the garage of the Rosemead condominium she shared with her roommate, Dele Okazaki. As the garage door came down, she heard a sound behind her. A man stood there with a handgun. Hernandez raised one hand to protect her face. He fired from only a few feet away. The bullet struck her hand and was deflected, apparently by the keys she was holding. She fell but remained conscious. Believing she had been killed, the gunman pushed past her and entered the condominium. Hernandez escaped through the garage. From outside, she heard another shot. She later saw the gunman leaving. When he pointed the weapon toward her again, she pleaded with him not to shoot. He lowered it and ran. Inside, Dale Okazaki was on the kitchen floor. She had been shot in the forehead at close range. A .22 caliber bullet was recovered during the autopsy. Near the garage, police found a blue cap bearing the name of the rock band AC/DC. The cap would become one of the many objects associated with the investigation, but at that moment it did not identify anyone. About an hour later, Tsai Lian Yu was driving in Monterey Park when another car forced her toward the curb. Witnesses saw a man pull her from her vehicle as she fought back. A neighbor heard her scream for help and went to a balcony to look. Another witness saw the attacker's car and noted its license number. When police arrived, Yu was still breathing. She had been shot twice in the chest at close range and died at the hospital. One of her shoes lay in the street. The other remained in the car. A torn piece of a $20 bill was on the ground. The engine was still running, the headlights were on, the transmission was in reverse, and the driver's door stood open. Everything around the car showed a drive interrupted in seconds. The bullets recovered from Daily Okazaki and Tsai Lian-yu had been fired by the same gun. Within roughly an hour, the attacker had moved from a condominium garage to a public street and killed 2 women in completely different situations. Police still had no name, but they could no longer treat the shootings as unrelated. The person they were seeking was mobile, willing to change settings without changing weapons, and capable of attacking again almost immediately. 11 days later, the pattern became harder to ignore. On the evening of March 28, Bruno Polo went to the Whittier home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara to deliver receipts from a business Vincent owned. The screen door was unlocked and the front door stood ajar. Polo called out but heard no answer. He left the receipts through the mail slot and returned the next morning with another employee. Vincent Zazzara was found on a couch in the den. He had been shot in the head at close range. Maxine was in the bedroom. She had been shot, stabbed, and mutilated after death. Her eyes had been removed and were never recovered. Drawers had been opened. Clothing was scattered across the rooms. A patio window screen had been removed, and the window had been pried open. A bucket had been placed beneath it. On the bucket and in the flower bed, investigators found impressions from an Avia athletic shoe. The Avia impression did not identify the intruder, but it gave detectives something that could survive changing witness descriptions and changing weapons. They could photograph it, cast it, measure it, and place it beside the next impression. If the same sole appeared in another house, the floor itself would make the connection. The bullets mattered too. 2.22 caliber rounds recovered from Maxine Zazzara would later be linked to another killing. The gun could travel even when the attacker changed neighborhoods. In early May, an intruder entered a Monrovia house by removing glass louvers from a kitchen window and using a patio chair to climb inside. Police found an Avia print on the kitchen sink and a palm print on the sink's surface. Again, the print did not immediately produce a name, but another scene had now carried the same footwear signature. Before dawn on May 14, a 911 dispatcher answered a call from a Monterey Park residence. A man's voice repeated, "Help me." Firefighters arrived within minutes. The iron security gate and front door were open. William Doy was sitting near a telephone in the den, unconscious and struggling to breathe. He died after being taken to a hospital. He had been shot in the head. His wife, Yuriko, was bruised and injured, with a thumb cuff attached to one hand. The den and bedroom had been ransacked. A bathroom window screen had been removed and left outside. Beneath the opening, police found the Avia shoe pattern again. The bullet that killed William Doy was later traced to a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. That pistol was eventually recovered from a convicted felon who had obtained it from Ramirez. Property taken from the Doy home, including jewelry and a wallet, was recovered from a man who had bought items from Ramirez. The stolen property began telling its own story. A gun could be thrown away. Shoes could be changed. Jewelry, wallets, televisions, and video cassette recorders still had to be carried out, sold, traded, or handed to someone. Each recovered item created a route leading away from a victim's home. Detectives did not yet know where those routes ended, but more than one was beginning to pass through the same hands. Near the end of May, the attacker entered the Monrovia home shared by 2 elderly sisters, Mabel Bell and Florence Lang. A neighbor noticed newspapers accumulating in the driveway. After receiving no answer on 2 visits, he entered through an unlocked door. Both women had been attacked with a hammer. Bell was found alive but comatose and later died from her injuries. Florence survived long enough to be hospitalized, but could not provide investigators with a usable account. Her wrists had been bound with an electrical cord, her ankles taped, and evidence showed she had been sexually assaulted. A pentagram had been drawn on a bedroom wall, and another had been marked on Bell's thigh. A lipstick tube lay on the floor. A bloodied hammer and a partial Avia print were also recovered. The newspapers in the driveway had been the first warning. Inside, one sister would never wake, and the other could not tell police who had entered their home. The pentagrams drew immediate attention. They were frightening, easy to photograph, and easy to turn into a headline. Detectives photographed them too, but then they kept working through the room. The removed screen, the bindings, the ransacking, the hammer, the stolen property, and the partial avia print. A symbol could tell the public how the intruder wanted to be seen. It could not tell police which freeway he used, where the stolen jewelry went, or which house he might enter next. The pentagram amplified the fear. The shoe impression linked one floor to another. Around the same period, a woman in Burbank awoke to a man standing over her bed with a gun and flashlight. He woke her 12-year-old son, handcuffed them together, demanded money and jewelry, and moved rapidly through the house. He placed the boy in a closet, bound the woman, sexually assaulted her, and threatened to have someone return if she reported him. She survived, and survival changed the investigation. A room could preserve a print or a bullet, but this witness had heard his voice, watched the way he moved through the house, and lived long enough to face a lineup. Jewelry taken from her home would later be recovered from the same buyer who acquired property from other attacks. By early summer, families could not comfort themselves with a simple victim profile. The attacker had entered the homes of elderly women, couples, people living alone, and parents with children nearby. He moved between modest houses and condominiums, between Los Angeles neighborhoods and separate cities. The apparent randomness made every open window feel personal. Police could not narrow him to one weapon, one neighborhood, or one method of killing. What remained consistent was how he moved, at night through the edge of a home, followed by rapid violence, ransacking, theft, and in several attacks sexual assault. He often stayed near freeway routes, and again, the avia soul appeared beneath him. On July 2nd, the first warning at Mary Cannon's Arcadia home was a window screen lying on the porch. Her newspaper was still in the driveway. Cannon, a widow in her 80s, was found in her bedroom. She had been strangled, beaten, and stabbed in the neck. The room had been ransacked. Investigators found avia impressions on the carpet and even on a tissue, another ordinary surface carrying the same uncommon design. 3 nights later, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett went to sleep in her own bedroom and woke after a savage attack. A tire iron lay near the bed. She had suffered severe head injuries and had also been strangled, but she was alive. She managed to call for her father. Her window screen had been removed, and the avia pattern was inside the room. For her family, the fact that she survived was everything. For detectives, it also meant the series had produced another living witness and another scene that could be compared. Only 2 days later, a neighbor noticed an open door and another removed screen at the Monterey Park home of Joyce Nelson. Nelson had been killed by blunt force injuries and strangulation. A newspaper carrier later testified that she had seen Ramirez near a parked car in the area before the murder. Beneath the open bedroom window, investigators found the avia impression yet again. At roughly the same time that morning, another woman in Monterey Park woke when her bedroom light came on. The intruder held a gun to her head, covered her mouth with a gloved hand, handcuffed her, took money and jewelry, and sexually assaulted her. He left her attached to the bed. She shouted until a neighbor heard her. That neighbor happened to be a deputy sheriff. Police found that the intruder had bent a small pet door and used it to enter the house. She survived and later identified Ramirez. Jewelry taken from her was recovered from the same resale chain. Within 5 days, detectives had moved from an elderly widow's bedroom to a teenager's hospital bed, and then to a house where a survivor had to shout until a neighbor heard her. Police saw the same shoe sole beneath each scene. The family saw an empty room, a hospital vigil, or a front door held open for investigators. By then, detectives were following 3 paths at once. The first was physical evidence: shoes, bullets, prints, restraints, and entry points. The second was the people who survived and could remember a face, a voice, a car, or the way the intruder moved. The third was the property he carried away: jewelry, wallets, stereos, televisions, and video cassette recorders, which kept passing through buyers who could be questioned. None of those paths had reached a name, but they were no longer leading in random directions. On July 19, Maxon and Lela Knighting missed breakfast with their daughter. She went to their home and found them in bed. Both had been shot, and both had had their throats cut. The bedroom had been searched. A bullet recovered from Lela matched the gun used against Dale Okazaki and Tsai Lian Yu. Jewelry from the Knighting home later appeared among property bought from Ramirez. A missed family breakfast had opened another scene, and the same gun and resale route were waiting inside it. The next night, an intruder entered another house through a sliding screen door. He shot Chainarong Kovananth in the head, killing him, then assaulted Chainarong's wife and threatened her children. He bound and struck their 8-year-old son, stole money, jewelry, and a video cassette recorder, and left. Avia prints were found on the front porch, rear porch, and inside the home. The bullet that killed Chainarong came from the same gun used in the Zazara murders. The surviving victim later identified Ramirez. Property taken from the house was recovered from the same buyer connected to earlier burglaries. By late July, changing weapons no longer concealed the repetition. One firearm reappeared in killings separated by weeks. Another linked a murder to attacks in different homes. The same stolen property buyer surfaced again. The shoe pattern crossed city boundaries. Survivors described the same thin man with long dark hair, prominent eyes, and decayed teeth. Police could describe him in fragments. They still could not put a name on the face. Part of the problem could be seen inside the evidence rooms. A bullet sat under one case number. A plaster cast of an Avia soul sat in another city. A survivor's description was filed at a sheriff's station, miles from a burglary report that mentioned a missing screen. Alone, each item looked local. Placed side by side, they began to describe one man moving across the county. Los Angeles County formed a large task force. Frank Salerno, who had worked the Hillside Strangler investigation, became one of its central figures. Gil Carrillo had already argued that crimes with different surfaces might belong to the same offender. Now they had to persuade agencies to share reports, evidence, and witness information, without losing the chain that would later have to stand up in court. No report arrived stamped with the words, Night Stalker. A removed screen could look like an ordinary burglar's entry point. A ransacked bedroom could make theft appear to be the main offense. A .22 caliber shooting might sit miles from a hammer attack or a strangulation. Detectives had to show that the changing violence did not erase the repeated mechanics beneath it. Under comparison microscopes, ballistics examiners studied the markings left on bullets. Footwear specialists measured the design, size, and wear of the Avia impressions. Detectives spread property lists beside pawn records and the names of known buyers. Survivor interviews were kept separate so that one person's memory did not contaminate another's. A connection that takes one sentence to explain now might have required days of calls, evidence transfers, and another agency agreeing to reopen a file. The freeways gave the attacker another advantage. He could leave one jurisdiction before officers in the next city even heard a radio bulletin. A stolen car could be abandoned before its description spread. Many victims lived within quick reach of major routes, allowing him to turn distance into confusion. To a frightened public, the attacks seemed to jump unpredictably across the map. To investigators, the roads showed how one man could make neighboring departments believe they were chasing separate crimes. Trial-era reporting described encounters that looked very different once Ramirez had a name. Los Angeles officers stopped him while the task force was already active. During one encounter, he ran. During another, an officer issued a citation for a minor violation and let him go because nothing connected the young man at the roadside to the murders. Police had been close enough to speak with him, yet the evidence gathered in distant property rooms had not reached the officer holding the citation book. That was the gap the task force had to close. More patrol cars alone could not solve it. The offender did not need to be caught carrying a murder weapon. He only needed to look like an ordinary young man during the few minutes an officer saw him. Until the prints, bullets, shoe casts, stolen goods, and survivor accounts converged, the description could still fit too many people. The Avia shoe became one of the task force's most guarded clues. Investigators contacted the manufacturer and learned that the model and size were uncommon. As long as the offender did not know the print mattered, he might keep stepping into bedrooms and leaving it behind. Once the detail reached the news, the shoes could vanish before police found the man wearing them. That created a painful choice. Residents needed enough information to protect themselves. Detectives needed to keep enough information secret to test future evidence. Every press conference could generate a useful tip, but it could also tell the attacker exactly what to destroy. While police tried to protect the clue, more families woke to gunfire. Early on August 5, Virginia Peterson awoke to a man entering her bedroom with a gun. He shot her in the face. Her husband, Christopher, woke and was shot in the head, but remained conscious and chased the intruder as more shots were fired. The attacker escaped through an unlocked sliding glass door. Both victims survived. 3 days later in Diamond Bar, Sakina Abawath woke to the sound of her husband Elias being shot beside her. The gunman struck her, restrained her, and forced her to swear upon Satan that she would not scream. He ransacked the bedroom, stole jewelry and money, and sexually assaulted her. When her 3-year-old son entered, the intruder bound the child and threatened the family. Elias Abawath died from a gunshot to the head. Sakina freed her little boy and gave him a task he could understand. She told him there would be candy and popsicles at the neighbor's house. The promise carried him out of the room and toward help while his mother was still restrained, and his father lay mortally wounded. Sakina survived, later identified Ramirez, and recognized property recovered from the resale chain. In a case filled with fingerprints and firearms, a mother's choice of a few simple words became one of the reasons there was a surviving witness. Ballistics connected the bullet that killed Elias to rounds fired in the Peterson attack. Again, a gun crossed from one scene to another. The Diamond Bar attack forced officials to speak more openly. Los Angeles County Sheriff Sherman Block confirmed that investigators believed several attacks were connected. Until then, many residents had feared a series without knowing its boundaries. The announcement gave the danger a larger shape, and daily life changed almost at once. Police switchboards filled with calls about shadows, prowlers, suspicious cars, loose gates, and noises outside windows. Gun shops and home security businesses saw demand rise. People bought locks, alarms, window bars, baseball bats, and dogs. Families walked from room to room checking screens before dark. Neighbors organized watches. Summer heat normally meant open windows. Now people shut them and tried to sleep in rooms that held the heat. What was a family supposed to rule out? A husband beside you had not protected the victims. Age had not protected them. Children in the house had not stopped the intruder. Neither an expensive home nor a modest one defined the risk. He did not wait in a place people could simply avoid. He crossed the boundary they believed was safest. A screen, a sliding door, a window, a pet opening. The media eventually settled on the name Night Stalker. Earlier labels had included the Valley Intruder and the Walk-In Killer. The new name helped the public understand that separate attacks might belong to one man, but it also gave him a character to perform. Survivors described satanic demands and threats. He appeared to follow the coverage. Each report could warn the public, feed the tip line, and enlarge the image he wanted at the same time. Then the case moved north. On August 18, an intruder attacked Peter and Barbara Pan in their San Francisco home. Peter Pan was shot and killed. Barbara was beaten, sexually assaulted, and shot, but survived. A pentagram and words were written on a wall. Ballistic and footwear evidence connected the attack to the Southern California series. The San Francisco attack expanded the hunt far beyond one county. The offender had traveled hundreds of miles and entered another major media market. It also created a conflict between agencies. San Francisco officials publicly discussed evidence, including details Los Angeles detectives had tried to protect. The warning reached more people, but the attacker now had reason to discard the shoes or weapon that connected him to earlier scenes. The task force gained public attention and lost secrecy in the same moment. For months, detectives had known more than the man they were hunting realized. After San Francisco, that advantage was shrinking. If he changed the few habits that remained consistent, the strongest pattern in the case could disappear. 6 days later, the offender returned to Southern California and made the mistake that finally turned the hunt toward a name. In Mission Viejo, 13-year-old James Romero was awake while his family slept. He heard sounds outside and saw a suspicious man near the house. He alerted his parents and the prowler fled. James watched the vehicle carefully enough to give police a description and part of its license plate. James could not know what would happen next, but he had done something officers had been waiting months for. He had watched the vehicle instead of only the fleeing man. The partial plate gave investigators a route they could trace. Not far away, the same man entered the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson. Carnes was shot several times in the head but survived. Erickson was beaten, restrained, and sexually assaulted. The intruder used the identity the press had given him, referring to himself as the Night Stalker and ordering her to deliver a message. Erickson survived and provided a detailed description. Investigators cast another shoe impression. More importantly, the vehicle information from James Romero helped police locate the stolen orange Toyota used that night. Police found the stolen orange Toyota abandoned in Los Angeles on August 28. Someone had tried to wipe it clean. The effort was almost successful. On or near the rearview mirror, a technician located a partial fingerprint that had survived. A few years earlier, that print might have joined the fingerprints from Jennie Vincow's screen as another silent card in a file. Los Angeles now had access to a computerized fingerprint search system that could move through records far faster than a manual comparison. It still required 3 things: a usable print, a matching record already in the database, and a technician who could confirm the result. This time, all 3 were present. The print matched Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old man from El Paso, with prior arrests in California, including auto theft. Police pulled his booking photograph. A fingerprint in a stolen car was not by itself proof of murder. Detectives had to ask whether Ramirez might have touched the Toyota at some unrelated time. The rest of the case quickly made that explanation harder to sustain. The vehicle had been used during the Mission Viejo attacks. Ramirez had prior arrests involving stolen cars. His appearance matched survivor descriptions. Associates were already talking about a man called Rick from El Paso who sold stolen property and seemed to know details that had not been widely released. For months, investigators had worked outward, from bedrooms, bullets, shoe prints, and stolen objects toward an unknown person. Now they could reverse the direction. They pulled Ramirez arrest records and photographs. They checked addresses, vehicles, friends, buyers, and firearms. A piece of jewelry could be followed from a victim's drawer to Ramirez and then to the person who bought it. Prints that had failed in a blind search could be placed directly beside his known cards. The old evidence began answering. Fingerprints from Jennie Vincow's removed, screen-matched Ramirez. The palm print from the Monrovia kitchen sink matched him. Buyers and associates connected him to property taken during the attacks. Firearms moved through the same circle. Survivors viewed lineups, and several identified him. The partial print had not solved every charge, but it had opened the door to evidence that had been waiting for a name. The case had reached its near answer, but police still had to find him. Commanders faced a dangerous decision. They could hold the photograph and attempt a quiet arrest, risking another attack while officers searched. Or they could release it to every television station and newspaper, warning Ramirez that police knew his identity but turning millions of residents into witnesses. They chose the public. Late on August 30, officials displayed the booking photograph and announced Richard Ramirez's name. An all-points bulletin described him as armed and dangerous. The decision ended the protection of secrecy. Television stations and newspapers now carried the same face. Police were warning Ramirez that they knew who he was, but they were also giving millions of people the ability to recognize him before he reached another home. Ramirez did not see the announcement when it aired. He had traveled by bus to Arizona and returned to Los Angeles early the next morning. Officers watched transportation points, but he passed through the terminal and moved into East Los Angeles without being stopped. Then he entered the liquor store and saw the newspaper. The fingerprint had given detectives a private answer. The newspaper placed that answer in every pair of hands. Ramirez ran from the store and boarded a bus. Calls began reaching police from clerks and residents who had seen the published photograph. The reports moved from one block to another faster than officers could organize a planned arrest. Ramirez tried to take a car from Manuela Villanueva. She escaped and called for help. Men nearby saw the struggle and chased him into an alley. He climbed a fence and reached Faustino Pinon, who was working on a car with its engine running. Ramirez tried to seize it. The two men struggled and the moving vehicle struck a chimney. Ramirez broke away and ran again. Across the street, Angelina de la Torre was sitting in a parked car. Ramirez demanded her keys, pulled her from the vehicle, and tried to drive away. She screamed instead of surrendering quietly. Doors opened. Neighbors came outside. Her husband, Manuel, arrived carrying a steel bar and struck Ramirez as he fled. More residents joined the pursuit. Within half a block, they brought him down. Newspapers with Ramirez's photograph were already in the neighborhood. As people gathered around the man on the pavement, some looked from the printed face to the person in front of them and understood whom they had chased. Police arrived to find Ramirez injured, exhausted, and surrounded by civilians, who had acted first because they saw a woman being attacked, and only afterward learned the scale of what they had stopped. The capture looked spontaneous because the final minutes were spontaneous. Everything that made those minutes possible had taken months. James Romero's attention to the license plate led police to the Toyota. The Toyota yielded the fingerprint. The computerized search turned the print into Ramirez's name. Old fingerprints, stolen property, guns, and survivor identifications strengthened the case. Then the public release placed his face in the liquor store and on the street. Residents brought him down. The investigation had finally made sure they knew whom they were looking at. At the station, Ramirez made incriminating statements later introduced at trial. The California Supreme Court's summary of the evidence records that he referred to himself as the stalker, said the police had him, and acknowledged being a killer. He also stressed that ordinary people, rather than officers, had caught him. The remarks mixed admission, threat, performance, and the satanic identity he had already used to frighten victims. Prosecutors did not need those statements to carry the case. That mattered. A confession can be withdrawn, challenged, or dismissed as exaggeration. The evidence against Ramirez had begun accumulating long before he sat in an interview room. His fingerprints were on Jennie Vincow's window screen and at the Monrovia entry point. Survivors identified him. Ballistics connected attacks to guns that passed through his possession. Witnesses placed him near homes and vehicles. Stolen property was recovered from people who had bought it from him. The Avia impressions linked scenes across the county. The AC's DC cap resembled one an associate had seen him wear. No single item carried every charge. Together, the items crossed and reinforced one another. At trial, the defense went directly after the places where that structure could break. Eyewitness identifications had been made under poor lighting, extreme stress, and sometimes after a witness had been shot or threatened. Maria Hernandez had initially selected the photograph of another man who resembled her attacker. Defense witnesses explained how a visible gun can pull attention away from a face, and how cross-racial identification can produce mistakes. Physical evidence also contained contradictions. A hair recovered from the Bell and Lang home did not match Ramirez. A blood sample from Mary Cannon's house was a different type from his. Miracaz's father testified that his son had been in El Paso during several late May attacks. Other witnesses challenged what could be seen from a parked car and how precisely a time of death could be fixed. Those were real issues, not formalities. Ramirez had already become a nationally recognizable defendant, and jurors had seen the public image before they entered the courtroom. The trial still had to answer a narrower question for every count. Did the admissible evidence prove that particular crime beyond a reasonable doubt? Prosecutors returned to a simpler point. One imperfect clue did not erase the others. A hair from an unknown person did not explain why property from the Bell and Lang home moved through Ramirez's resale network. A weakness in one identification did not remove his fingerprints from other scenes. An alibi covering a few dates did not account for the full timeline. The case did not require every clue to be flawless. It required independent forms of evidence to keep arriving at the same defendant. Ramirez helped keep the public mythology alive in court. He displayed pentagrams, invoked Satan, and appeared to use the attention and as another stage. At one arraignment, he raised a marked palm and shouted a satanic phrase. Cameras carried those images far beyond the courtroom, making the performance easier to remember than a fingerprint card, a ballistics chart, or a property receipt. But the performance was not what convicted him. The evidence described something more concrete than a supernatural figure. A burglar who entered homes, stole property, used extreme violence, sexually assaulted victims, changed weapons, and used satanic language to intimidate and dramatize himself. The symbols became his public image. The prints, bullets, witnesses, and stolen goods became the case. The trial took years to begin. Jury selection started in 1988. The proceeding became one of the largest and most expensive criminal trials California had seen at the time. Dozens of crimes had to be presented with separate witnesses, medical evidence, property records, firearms comparisons, and identification testimony. During deliberations in August 1989, one juror failed to appear. She was found shot to death in her home. The other jurors immediately feared the killing might somehow be connected to Ramirez. Investigators determined that she had been killed by her boyfriend in an unrelated murder-suicide. Even after years in custody, Ramirez's reputation had so altered the atmosphere around the trial that an unrelated death was first understood as a possible reach from the defendant to the jury. The judge replaced the juror and ordered deliberations to continue. On September 20, 1989, the jury found Ramirez guilty on all 43 counts tried in Los Angeles. The convictions included 12 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, 5 attempted murders, multiple sexual offenses, and 14 first-degree burglaries. The jury also found special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. The 13 murder convictions represented the killings charged in the Los Angeles case. Separate allegations existed elsewhere, including the San Francisco murder of Peter Pan. Later summaries often give different totals because they combine convictions, suspected crimes, separate charges, and cases linked after trial. The legally precise statement is that the Los Angeles jury convicted Ramirez of 30 other felonies and 30 other felons. During the penalty phase, the defense chose not to present evidence. On November 7, 1989, the court sentenced him to death. The sentence did not end the legal process. California death judgments receive automatic review, and Ramirez's case remained on appeal for years. In 2006, the California Supreme Court affirmed the convictions and death sentence. More than 20 years had passed since the summer of locked windows, but survivors and relatives were still tied to the case through hearings, appeals, and the public repetition of what had happened inside their homes. The case still had one more forensic development. In 2009, San Francisco police announced that DNA evidence linked Ramirez to the April 1984 killing of 9-year-old Mei Leung, who had been found in the basement of a residential hotel in the Tenderloin. The crime predated Jennie Vincow's murder by more than 2 months. It had not been part of the Los Angeles trial, and Ramirez was not convicted of it. The DNA announcement changed the known beginning of his violence and raised the possibility that other unsolved crimes might sit outside the famous 1985 timeline. The DNA announcement also showed how long evidence can wait for the right technology. In 1984, fingerprints from Jennie Vincow's screen existed without a rapid way to search them. In 1985, a computerized fingerprint system turned the partial print from the Toyota into a name. More than 20 years later, a national DNA database connected Ramirez to another child's killing. The evidence had not changed. The ability to ask it new questions had. Ramirez never reached an execution date. On June 7, 2013, he died in a hospital while still under a death sentence. The reported cause was complications from B-cell lymphoma, with other serious health conditions noted. He was 53 years old. Ramirez's death ended the possibility of execution without answering every question about the full number of his victims. Legal closure also meant different things to different families. Some watched a jury convict him after giving testimony about the worst night of their lives. Some learned years later that forensic evidence had linked him to another killing. Survivors carried injuries and memories, and several had also carried the prosecution. By remembering a face, identifying stolen property, or describing what happened when no one else in the room could speak. The Night Stalker case is often described as a series of random attacks, and the victims did not fit one simple category. The weapons changed, the cities changed, and the violence crossed hundreds of miles. Yet Ramirez repeatedly used ordinary points of access: an unlocked sliding door, a loose screen, an open window in summer heat, a pet entrance, a home near a freeway. He turned familiar parts of a house into entry routes, then used the road system to make one series look like many separate crimes. Investigators could not predict the next victim. They learned to follow the things he failed to change. The uncommon avia soul appeared in a flower bed, on a sink, across carpet, on a tissue, on porches, and inside bedrooms. The same guns linked victims in different cities. Stolen jewelry traveled to the same buyers. Survivors remembered the same face. Fingerprints remained on a window screen, a kitchen sink, and finally inside a stolen Toyota. The last print did more than identify Richard Ramirez. It allowed police to compare the old evidence directly, place a name beneath a booking photograph, and make the most consequential public decision of the investigation: release the face before they had the man. On August 31, 1985, that photograph lay open in an East Los Angeles liquor store. Ramirez saw it and ran. A clerk called police. Residents followed the disturbance from one block to the next. Manuela Villanueva escaped his attempt to take her car. Angelina de la Torre screamed when he dragged her from another. Neighbors came outside and chased a stranger through an alley and over a fence before they fully understood who he was. By the time officers arrived, the newspaper had reached the curb, and the hunt was over. For the families already harmed, nothing on that page could restore what had been taken. But Ramirez could no longer reach another open window, another bedroom, or another family. A fingerprint had become a name. The name had become a face, and the face, once placed in public hands, had nowhere left to hide.